A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. Hosting with me, Simon Caudry, this morning are Neville Hicks and Emil Kalinowski. Good morning, gents.
Good morning.
Good morning.
We are delighted to be joined on the show this morning by Rebecca Spang. Rebecca is a professor of history at Indiana University, who in 2015 wrote a book titled Stuff and Money in the Time of the French Revolution, where she investigates money innovation at a time of political upheaval, a subject perhaps that couldn't be more relevant to today's world. Rebecca is joining us at the Cayman Investment Forum next week, and we're delighted to have her here by phone to preview her presentation and learn a little bit more about money's historical roots. Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us this morning for a conversation and a preview of what we may expect from you at the Investment Forum next week.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Now, Neville and Emil, just remind us, the forum's coming up next week. Just remind our listeners what it is, where they register and all that sort of stuff.
It's the 5th annual Cayman Investment Forum. This is obviously one of our marquee events from the CFA Society Cayman standpoint. We're thrilled, and actually Emil has been kind of the ringleader putting this together. And this year we've done something different where historically we've always kind of gone and brought in various speakers with different ideas and concepts. But this year we're actually focused around the theme of money and the different forms of money. Hence why we have Rebecca on and certainly her expertise. So looking forward to hearing a little bit about that. But if you're interested at all, and I strongly suggest attending the conference, you can go to CaymanInvestmentForum.com and you can register there, and you can use our code MONEYSENSE and it will get you a little discount for all of our listeners. So that takes place on October 11th, Wednesday, October 11th. It's a half-day event at the Ritz-Carlton, followed by some networking, and it's always a great turnout. So I strongly suggest you get to the website, check it out, and attend.
Fabulous. Well, thank you, Neville, and we look forward to seeing you here in person, Rebecca, in the Cayman Islands. Well, Neville hit the nail on the head there in talking about the forum's focus is money. You're a professor of history who studied the history of money, so perhaps we should start off right at the beginning and ask the question, well, what exactly is money, and what does it need to be? What attributes does it need to have for society to even accept it as the concept of money?
Right. So, in a very fundamental sense, what money is it's a record of transactions that has been made and a promise of the possibility of making transactions in the future. And I realize that sounds extraordinarily abstract, and very often when I'm teaching my history of money course, students expect it to be a sort of numismatics course, and we do talk about money objects, but the fact is that over the course of human history, so many different kinds of objects, be they coins, be they pieces of paper, be they shells, have been used for money and have, facilitated international commerce. So to really get at what money is, we need to do what the economists do and focus on its functions. One of the most important functions for money that any economist will tell you is, of course, the means of exchange, but it also has to be a store of value. So while we often think money needs to be backed by something, the truth is that what it really needs isn't to have a past, but to have a future. For money to be accepted, those of us using it need to have a reasonable expectation that somebody in the future, tomorrow, next week, next year, will value it and will accept it. And that expectation that we have that somebody will take it from us in the future in exchange for something else, that expectation in times of social, political stability is generally almost unconscious. Like, we don't even stop and think, gosh, if I have my paycheck deposited in dollars, will that still be any good next week or next month? But when there's real political, social, economic unrest, then those sorts of expectations and calculations about money's future value or its loss of that value come very much to the fore in people's minds.
To my mind, what you're explaining is almost akin to a belief system in that sense, in that money doesn't have to have any fundamental value. That would, I suppose, be somewhat heretical to those who are gold believers or believe that money should have some substance and form. But you're describing something which, as long as enough people believe it, it has the same essence as a religion, in a sense that people believe it enough, it will continue.
Yes, that's right. That's right. People who use a currency are a community of believers. And so when you mention, the people who are enthusiastic about gold, what I see when I read the writings of those people is a faith in gold. And they demonstrate that faith with reference to the past. They say, in past centuries, people have valued gold, and that's very true. But of course, for money to have value, it's not as if because we have gold we can get into a time machine and go back in time and spend our gold. We need to have a reasonable expectation that that value will continue into the future.
Why would it be more reasonable to have an expectation that a piece of paper or a 1 and a 0 would have more value in the future than something that is made of wood, metal, or some other element?
I think that's a very good question. And after all, if we imagine a sort of dystopian future in which there's no electricity, then digital money is really not a good idea. And commodity money may be a much, much better idea. On the other hand, if our vision of the future is of increasing degrees of electronic communication, of global interdependence, then digital money seems to make a lot of sense.
And from a historical perspective, is today's money driven by some historical trends that are obvious to see, or is it because governments have imposed it upon citizens?
Well, I think there are two really fundamental characteristics of any money that we need to keep in mind. And each of these characteristics, if you will, has two settings. So we're really looking at a matrix. So the first characteristic is going to be the relationship between material and symbolic value. We often talk about gold as having a real material value. It's not, quote unquote, purely a symbol. And gold is very useful if you're making artificial teeth, if you're doing various sorts of high-tech things. But, as many people have said, can't eat it, can't shelter under it, there isn't enough of it to build a house from it. So there are ways in which it's not the material of gold that's so important, it's its symbolic value. It's its association with the sun, its association with divinity, associations with religion. So even what we often think of as the most material money has enormous symbolic value. And conversely, as I just pointed out, what we sometimes think of as a purely abstract money, the deposit in my bank account, that would fail if we did not have the electric and electronic infrastructure that makes that possible. So there's one set of sort of on and off switches for money, which we toggle back and forth between different degrees of materiality, different degrees of symbolism. And then there's another category, and this one doesn't get quite as much attention, I think, which is whether money is publicly issued, that is, by the state in the name of the public good, or is it privately issued by individuals? And those individuals might be, so in the Middle Ages, bishops issued their own currency. Right? The growth of the state in the 16th to 17th century is a matter of kings saying that dukes and bishops and towns were not going to issue their own money. The king was going to issue the money. So there's a move back and forth between periods in which more money is privately issued and when it's centralized and issued by a public entity.
Rebecca, we're hosting this forum because there's a sense that, yes, we know historically money has changed, but is money changing today? Is it happening now? I can think of a few examples, for example, in Kenya and Sweden. Those are just some examples I can think of. But But am I correct? Is money changing today? Is something happening?
Well, I think if we go to those two key characteristics I just mentioned, I think something is happening. We very often hear it said that it's the central banks that control the money supply, but that's not true. The governor of the Bank of England was very upfront about this in an interview with the FT a few years ago. He said, look, 95% of the money, it is created by private banks when they make loans for various, say, construction ventures or any sort of investment. So we're actually in a period where we think we mainly have central government money, but what we mainly have is private money.
Rebecca, let me just touch on that.
We need to think about.
Let me just touch on that a bit.
Yeah.
Because saying that it's not governments that control our money supply may well come as quite a shock to a lot of people who say, but hang on, when the Fed raises interest rates or the Bank of England changes interest rates or the European Central Bank does quantitative easing, it has a huge impact on money and it has a huge impact on our economies. Isn't it true that although 95% of money creation may be done by the private sector, it wouldn't be permitted were it not for central banks giving license to banks to do that and having ratios that they must abide by? So they can set those ratios to allow banks to do it, but it is all subject to the governance of the central bank.
You're right. That there is some sort of regulatory framework. What some people, and Pettifor is a good example of this, what some people are arguing is that there needs to be much more regulation, that the state needs to be much more involved in deciding what sort of projects money is issued for and which ones it isn't issued for. We're actually right now in a fairly loose regulatory framework where it's quite easy for capital to escape government controls. And that you're quite right to say that there could be a different, more rigid, stricter regulatory framework, though that would probably have to be on an international level, given global capital flows.
Rebecca, do you think that's good or bad as far as government or monetary authorities having more or less control, or less control as it stands right now?
Yeah, well, that's a very vexed question. There's no doubt that the fairly loose regulatory framework has allowed enormous investment opportunities, possibilities for growth. Obviously, we've seen the S&P, most other major stock indexes go up and up. So all of that looks very good. What is perhaps problematic is the accompanying graphs that show that since 1980, when this sort of moved toward a less regulated framework really developed, we've also seen growing global inequality. And when there's too much inequality, there's often political and social unrest, and that's not good for anybody, anywhere in the economic sector.
Now, Rebecca, we unfortunately have to take a brief break here. Talking of money, we have to take a commercial break and earn a little bit for the radio station. But do stay with us. In about 60 seconds, we'll continue our conversation with Rebecca Spang on the subject of money. Welcome back. In the second half of today's show, we're going to continue our conversation on money and what it means in the world today with Rebecca Spang, Professor of History at Indiana University. Rebecca, before the break, you mentioned that central banks perhaps couldn't actually, even if they wanted to, influence things on a nationwide level. Is it the case then that money now has become so diffuse and so spread out that actually central banks and governments are almost powerless to influence what money really is?
I don't think they're powerless, but they don't have as much power as they are sometimes credited with having. And so it's very common, whether we're talking about austerity in Britain in the aftermath of the financial crisis, whether we're thinking about major political figures in the United States who will say something like, all across America, families are tightening our belts and the government needs to do so as well. It's a very, very common rhetoric that confuses the public status of the state with the private state of households. But one of the reasons that happens, I think, because there is not much public political support for a government that, quote unquote, just prints money. So it really would take a considerable reconfiguration of thinking about money and its relation both to the economy and to politics in order for individual states to really regain control of the money supply.
Rebecca, your colleague at the Investment Forum, one of the presenters, Jeffrey Snyder, is much of the same opinion. We interviewed him a few weeks back, and he likewise feels that the countries have lost control of this Eurodollar system, this bank balance sheet capacity, that it's beyond them. And he makes the point that it's sick, that it's unhealthy, and it's contracting, and it's led to the economic and political difficulties of the last 8 years. Very quickly, do you agree with that viewpoint? And secondly, he believes that the only way to kind of bring it back into control would be to have some sort of global international agreement, perhaps like in 1944. Is that possible? Is there a global currency on our horizon? Is that the solution?
That's a very interesting idea. I do think that when we contemplate the extraordinary growth and productivity of European, and really that's both East and West European economies, post-1944. If we think about the 1950s in the United States, if we think about the recovery of Japan post-war, one of the things that made all of that growth possible was the comparative monetary stability afforded by the Bretton Woods system. And we don't have that now. We really don't.
I find that an interesting statement, actually, Rebecca, because when you look, I studied economics myself, and when you study economics, the importance of monetary stability is first among equals in terms of the things that must be organized. But we're almost at a situation when you see the political upheaval that's going on, where people take it for granted, and therefore the importance of money and its stability is just taken as being something that happens automatically, and therefore not even considered by politicians anymore. Is that a concern?
I think that's right. I do think that's right. I think it's been so long since we've had a period of really sustained instability that affected people on a day-to-day basis. But when I say we don't have the monetary stability we had during Bretton Woods, what I mean is that ordinary individuals on the street may not be greatly affected by, the change in value of, say, the US dollar compared to the British pound compared to the euro, though it may affect their holiday plans. But it certainly has dramatic effects in terms of what sort of imports they have access to, what sorts of jobs they have access to. So it's having an effect on people in ways they don't even realize. And if we were to experience a period of dramatic monetary instability, and by that I don't mean just high inflation rates, so that's one obvious form of monetary instability, but we could have structural deflation, which is just as bad, or we could have such a proliferation of money objects in which, because there's freedom of money, as some people have argued for, I can't necessarily expect that some other person, just because they're in the United States, is going to be willing to transact in dollars. So maybe they're going to demand silver. So maybe they're going to demand gold. That level of instability would really shake people up. But it's been so long since we've had it. I think you're right. It's not on the politicians' radar.
But and I just talk about, it's interesting because from a globalization standpoint, with technology, we've come such a long way from Bretton Woods, for instance, from a trade perspective. But even still, if you look at governments, various currencies, governments looking to devalue the currency, even policies becoming more nationalistic, even if we look at the US, if we look at UK and Europe, it's almost as though, we've gone forward and then we've kind of come backwards. And what will trigger, when in theory, from a technology standpoint and a globalization standpoint, we're so much more advanced, but we're still on a monetary side kind of living in an old world.
I think what's happening, it's not the monetary side that is necessary old world, but it's the politics. And I want to go back to the previous comment that the politicians aren't thinking about the money. And I think in terms of thinking about money as a system, that's right. They're thinking about, their own balance books, but they're not necessarily thinking about the chaos that would be produced. For instance, if Greece, instead of Britain, if Greece had left the Eurozone and had to recreate a national currency, that would have been chaos. I think you're quite right to say that in terms of technology, in terms of the flow of materials, we live in an ever more global world.
I guess to be flippant, one could have argued back hundreds of years ago that investing in tulips also diversified your portfolio, although they did actually have an expiry date, whereas perhaps electrons have a slightly longer expiry date, one could say. Now, let me change tack ever so slightly. Monetary innovation. You've talked about that as being something that has occurred over history. Does monetary innovation occur because of political upheaval, or does it occur in response to it, as a general rule? Because we are living in what could be described as a somewhat upheaval-driven world right now.
We are. Thinking about the historical example I assessed, which is the French Revolution, what you see there is a feedback loop. You've got a sort of monetary innovation that's meant to respond to a political crisis. The monetary innovation is popular with some people, desperately unpopular with others. It hence intensifies the political crisis. As the political crisis worsens, monetary innovation increases. The further increase in monetary innovation makes the political crisis even worse, and we get this feedback loop spiral into chaos, really, until eventually we have the Napoleonic Wars. So that's really not anything to look forward to, I think.
No.
In contrast, what Britain does during the period of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars is not to innovate, but to limit and to regulate. There's a period of nearly 20 years during the Napoleonic Wars in which the Bank of England's bills are no longer exchangeable for gold or silver. And then they start again exchanging them for money for coins, for metal, after the peace in I think 1817 or 1818. So, Britain certainly makes it through those wars in much stronger political, social, economic shape than does France. So one might say that the correct answer in a period of political upheaval is not monetary innovation, but to look carefully at the system you have and try to make whatever adjustments necessary to keep it in place. Because if you don't, then monetary instability is going to be just one more thing to which politics has to respond.
Well, that is a fabulous point on which to end. Our time is up, but it's a good point on which to end because it gives people the teaser as to what to expect at the forum, which is either the outbreak of global war or potentially a calmer, more sedate outlook. So if that doesn't have people on the edge of their seats and signing up, I don't know what will. Neville, the 11th of October is the forum.
Yeah.
Ritz-Carlton, and the website to go to is
CaymanInvestmentForum.com.
Fabulous. Look, Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure hosting you on the show today, and we look forward to seeing you in a week's time here in Cayman.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to being there.
Absolute pleasure. As a final note before we leave, I wish just to once again thank all of our listeners and remind you that today's show will be available as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage you, if you have a question, to email us at moneysense@candw.ky or post us a question on Twitter at MoneySense Radio. With that, thank you once again, goodbye, and please do tune into Money Sense in 2 weeks' time.